After the strategic successes of the Ukrainians at Kiev, Kharkiv or Kherson, came a period of positional fighting. The front line has stabilized. However, this by no means indicates peace. On the contrary, the Ukrainians are advancing on Kreminna and eliminating several hundred Russian soldiers with a singular rocket attack on a school. On the other hand, the Russians continuously put pressure on Bakhmut, despite the Ukrainians' recent counterattack. Let's take a look at the latest acts of the Russo-Ukrainian war on the map. The report was produced in cooperation with the Rochan Consulting Analytical Center, cited among others by the Wall Street Journal and the New York Times. Since the beginning of the war in Ukraine, Rochan publishes a daily war report called Ukraine Conflict Monitor, which presents an in-depth and unique analysis of the battlefield. You can purchase access to Ukraine Conflict Monitor via the link in the description. Kharkiv-Luhansk direction. Ukrainians keep the initiative in the Kharkiv and Luhansk oblasts. The changes are not sudden, but the armed forces of Ukraine are moving forward. The Ukrainians probably captured Chervonopopivka and cut off the road connecting Svatove with Kreminna. In general, Ukrainians are approaching the latter city. Their presence is confirmed in a heavily forested area south of Kreminna. The Ukrainians will probably reach Kreminna soon, but the city is unlikely to be captured immediately. Although the fall of Kreminna would be a tactical success for Kyiv, probably it will not have a significant operational impact. The entire area is quite heavily urbanized. Cities like Rubizhne, Lysychansk and above all Severodonetsk will still pose a significant challenge for Ukrainians fighting in this direction. In an ideal scenario, Kyiv would like to surround these cities from Rubizhne to Borivske, while the Siversky Donets River would limit the Russian depth and thus limit the Russian maneuver. A simultaneous attack from Spirne in the direction of Borivske would then cut off the Russian forces in the Lysychansk-Severodonetsk area. This is just one of the likely scenarios that Kyiv can pursue. The Russians are trying to retaliate with counterattacks, as well as trans-border attacks. According to the Ukrainian staff, the Russians carried out a cross-border attack on Ternova. They did not capture the village and were probably pushed back by the Ukrainian Territorial Defense Forces. However, this event demonstrates Russia's ability and readiness to carry out small-scale attacks or airstrikes across the border, mainly to force Kyiv to keep troops on the border with Russia. Such attacks will probably continue in the future. Moving south, since the capture of Kisilivka by the Ukrainians, we have not seen any major changes in the front near Dvorichne. Kyiv forces tried to advance on Nizhna Duvanka, but these attempts did not bring any changes on the front. The Russians have been expecting a bigger Ukrainian push towards Nizhna Duvanka for weeks, but this not had happened. Both sides have also been fighting for Novoselivske for weeks. The Russians probably control the settlement, but it can be assumed that the entire area around the R66 road is heavily contested. The relationship of forces in this direction is confirmed by the words of the governor of the Luhansk region, Serhiy Haidai. In early December, he stated that the Russians are building a third line of defense near Starobielsk. The first is based on the Oskil River, and the second is set between Svatove and Kreminna. It can be assumed that the Russians are considering a scenario in which their forces at Svatove surrender and will be forced to retreat behind another line of defense. Starobielsk is located about 50 kilometers or 30 miles from the current front line. Donetsk direction. Just as the Ukrainians retain the initiative in the Kharkiv and Luhansk directions, the Russians are generally the dominant party in the Donetsk direction. For months, the Russians have been advancing on Bakhmut literally meter by meter. But the December attack by the Ukrainians effectively wiped out the last few months of Russian territorial progress. As a result, the Russians were driven back from Bakhmut and Opytne. The attack coincided with President Zelensky's visit to the city, which has become the epicenter of recent military operations. Last week, however, confirmed that the Russians' determination to capture Bakhmut remains strong, and its combat potential in this region is not exhausted. As a result, the Russians have already managed to recapture most of Opytne and again bite into Bakhmut. In addition, the Russians maintained a general thrust in the Siversk direction by attacking Verkhno-Kamianskie and Spirne. Capturing Spirne would allow Moscow to cut off the Ukrainian forces at Bilohorivka. However, even at the height of their artillery attacks in the summer and after the fall of Lysychansk, the Russians failed to approach Siversk. We expect no changes in this respect. But it must be added that the Russians tried to extend their attacks horizontally towards Siversk, trying to break through the Ukrainian defenses near Vesele, towards Vyimka. Recently, however, they have not achieved any gains in this area, and the front line has remained unchanged. The capture of Yakovlivka facilitated the attack on Vesele. Capturing this village allows the Russians to advance either north towards Vesele or west, north of Soledar. So far, Moscow seems to have chosen the first option, but it is likely to shift its forces to another axis if attacks to the north fail to produce the desired results. The Russians also remained offensively engaged in the Avdiivka area and the outskirts of Donetsk. They attacked Avdiivka almost every day, and artillery attacks on the city were regular. However, the front line in this area has not changed. Despite the ongoing fighting in Marinka, the situation in the city has hardly changed. Although the situation is fluid, it can be assumed that the control over the city is divided in half. Rochan still maintains that the Russians might be dispersed to avoid being annihilated by HIMARS attacks. Yet this is not a permanent practice in Russian forces, as was shown by the massacre in Makiivka in the Donetsk region. On Sunday, information appeared about the HIMARS strike on a school in Makiivka, where mobilized Russian reservists were located. What's more, the building was also supposed to be a storage place for ammunition. The number of dead is not verifiable. The Russian MOD reported 89 victims of the attack, but unofficial reports say up to 600 dead and wounded. Russian Telegram accounts described the attack as, quote, slaughter, tragedy, mass grave, unquote. Interestingly, the attack was to be carried out on New Year's Eve, and during Vladimir Putin's speech. With Ukrainian access to Western intelligence and weak operational security in the rear, Russian forces are very vulnerable to such strikes. Zaporizhia direction. In the past weeks, we have not noted any major developments on the front line in the Zaporizhia region. Military activity is limited to artillery exchanges on the front line and ground fighting. There are also no indications to suggest that either side is preparing for a large-scale attack to break the stalemate in this direction. Still, two long-term developments can be discerned. The first relates to Russian defensive actions in anticipation of a Ukrainian ground attack, and the second to Ukrainian precision strikes on Russian targets in southern Ukraine. Confirmations of these assumptions can be noticed. Firstly, the Russians started to build fortifications in Rozivka on the approach to Mariupol. Secondly, Kyiv continues to strike Russian targets. According to the Ukrainian staff, a rocket strike destroyed an anti-aircraft missile complex, an ammunition depot, and 5 pieces of military equipment near Polochy and Velika Bilozerka. A missile strike was also carried out against an S-300 system in an unspecified area in the Zaporizhia region, destroying various pieces of equipment and injuring 150 people. There were reports on social media that the Russian reservist base in Titove had also been hit, while the Ukrainian General Staff said that a missile strike near Novobilozerivka had injured up to 100 Russian service members, 15 of whom were serving in the FSB. It appears that the Ukrainian strategy in Zaporizhia resembles that of Kherson. As a result of the constant threat of HIMARS attacks, Russian forces will have to remain heavily dispersed, with their logistical lines and command and control centers under constant attack. Consequently, the likelihood of a large-scale Russian counterattack is minimal. Time will tell whether this will also lead to a concentration of Ukrainian forces for another offensive later this winter. According to Russian sources, in December, the Ukrainians assembled 3 maneuver brigades and 5 territorial defense brigades in this direction. This is an insufficient force for a large-scale attack, although it may indicate the early stages of a buildup of forces. Kherson direction. As in the Zaporizhia region, recent times have not brought any changes in the Kherson region. Here too, there is no indication that either side is preparing a large-scale operation. Russian forces in the area are too weak and too dispersed to undertake a river crossing operation of high complexity. Such an operation is beyond Russian capabilities at this stage, and there is no indication that the situation will change over the winter. The Russians are concentrating their efforts on patrolling the islands on the Dnieper and conducting artillery strikes against Ukrainian military and civilian targets north of the river. The Russians regularly shell Kherson, Nikopol, Oleshki, and Ochakiv in southern Ukraine. Ukrainian artillery also remains active. According to the Ukrainians, 200 Russian service members were killed due to a missile strike near Fedorivka. Other Russian concentration sites, such as Chaplyanka, Velika Leptycha, Kakhovka, and Radensk, were also allegedly hit. Belarus direction. Belarus remains unknown. In the last month, both Sergei Shoigu and Vladimir Putin made trips to Belarus, which is not a very frequent event. Many read this as a growing argument that Minsk will soon join the war. Rochan estimates the chances of this eventuality at 50%. Belarus continues to conduct multi-unit readiness exercises, but their scale is unclear. In mid-December, The Economist published an interview with General Valery Zaluzhny, Commander-in-Chief of the Ukrainian Armed Forces. Zaluzhny stated that Moscow is preparing about 200,000 fresh soldiers, and that there is no doubt that, quote, Russia will attack Kyiv once more, unquote. Rochan thinks that's not completely certain. A strike from Belarus creates opportunities, but it is also loaded with high risk. The level of readiness, experience, and equipment of the Ukrainians differs from that of February 2022. Kyiv has been preparing for such a scenario for months. The topography is also not helping attackers because swamps, rivers, and other watercourses complicate the operations of armored formations and make it easier for defenders to channel the movement of advancing formations into minefields or areas covered by massed artillery fire. Russia direction. In addition to ongoing sabotage activities, the Ukrainians occasionally carry out drone strikes against targets in Russia proper. The most important such event recently was the Ukrainian strikes on the Russian long-range air bases in Saratov, Engels II, and Ryazan, Diaghilevo. Ryazan is about 500 kilometers from the Ukrainian border, while Saratov is about 600 kilometers away. Combat damage assessment indicates that the Tu-22M3 and the APA-80 ground propulsion unit at Diaghilevo were damaged. Satellite images published by ImageSat show traces of burning near the Tu-22M3 bomber in Diaghilevo. According to the Russian Ministry of National Defense, it was Soviet jet drones, probably Tu-141, that struck airbases to disable Russian long-range aircraft. According to the Russians, anti-aircraft defenses intercepted unmanned aerial vehicles near the bases, and falling debris and a minor explosion slightly damaged two aircraft. The losses have a marginal impact on the Russian bomber fleet, but they prove that Kyiv can fight back even without ATACMS missiles. It is possible, however, that due to the strike, some aircraft were moved to other bases. Attacks on Ukrainian targets throughout the country, but on a much larger scale, are constantly carried out by Moscow. On the day of the attack on Russian bases, Kremlin forces launched another wave of attacks on Ukrainian critical infrastructure targets. In total, more than 70 rockets were fired, of which, according to the Ukrainians, more than 60 were shot down. Thus, the impact on the power grid was relatively limited. Repairs were made quickly, but the planned power outages, depending on the intensity of Russian strikes, will remain in Ukraine until spring due to the power deficit and damage to transmission lines. Recent weeks have shown that the effectiveness of Ukrainian air defense is constantly increasing. Ukrainians are able to shoot down 80 to 85% of incoming missiles or drones. There were situations where all incoming objects were shot down. Therefore, the Russians tried to shift their tactics and attack one target with more missiles. With the so-called saturation attack, they tried to dominate the anti-aircraft defense in a given area, increasing the chances of hitting the target. On the other hand, this approach consumes more rockets. A few more puzzles that make up the entire Ukrainian air defense system will be added by the Patriot battery, which the Americans have committed to deliver to the Ukrainians. Recent reports suggest that the Patriot unit may appear in Ukraine as early as February, which is very soon. We do not want to speculate, but the Ukrainians can already train in using the system. A typical Patriot battery consists of up to 8 launchers, each equipped with 4 tubes. As a result, the battery can fire up to 32 rounds in one salvo. One Patriot battery will not drastically increase the range of Ukrainian air defense. It will allow for filling some gaps, but its protection area is relatively small. On the other hand, it increases Western support for Ukraine, thus making Kyiv's struggle more sustainable in the long run. It also probably paves the way for deploying additional batteries and possibly other systems in Ukraine. This may be necessary given the recent speeches of Vladimir Putin and Volodymyr Zelensky. There is no indication that both sides are willing to engage in real negotiations. In early December, Putin said that Russian actions in Ukraine could be a, quote, lengthy process, and that the territorial gains were, quote, very significant results for Russia. Putin described the Sea of Azov as, quote, the inner sea of the Russian Federation, unquote. 3 days later, Zelensky replied that the war did not start in 2022, but in 2014, when the Russians grabbed Crimea. He stated that the war could end only when the Ukrainians regained the Crimean Peninsula. Quote, "The return of Crimea will mean the restoration of real peace," said Zelensky. Therefore, it can be said with great confidence that it is implausible that Ukraine will enter into negotiations with Russia which will not result in the complete withdrawal of Russian forces from Ukraine. Kyiv largely maintains the initiative and has achieved significant operational successes since September. Access to Western-made equipment and ammunition and Western-provided intelligence favor Kyiv in this war. There are also no signs of a sudden international situation change, in which support for Ukraine, for example due to the cold winter, would decrease. That said, both sides need to be prepared for months of fierce fighting ahead.